Imagine having just $11 to your name, rent due in 4 days, 3 kids to feed, and no job after 19 years. That's exactly where Loretta May Calloway found herself. From the outside, perfect life, clean curtains, swept porch, constant smile. Inside, breaking. But then she remembered her grandmother's old handwritten cookbook, forgotten habits from the hardest times that fed families with almost nothing. No apps, no loans, just real, practical wisdom. What she did next over the next 30 days, it wasn't luck, it wasn't magic, it was enough. And the one decision she made when no one was watching changed everything. Stick around. I'm about to show you every single step, meal, and money-saving trick she used to turn $11 into survival and dignity. The termination letter arrived on a Friday. By Saturday morning, it was tucked under a stack of unpaid bills on the counter because Loretta didn't have the luxury of spending a whole weekend being devastated. She had 3 kids. Bo was 6, Marcus was 9, and Gracie was 12. Old enough to sense something was wrong, young enough that Loretta still had the power to shape what it meant to them. She sat down at the kitchen table that Saturday night after the kids were in bed, and she did the one thing most people avoid when money gets tight. She looked directly at the numbers. Not approximately, exactly. Total money available, $318. Total obligations, rent, electricity, water, school lunch fund, $311.50. That left $6.50 for everything else. Groceries, medicine, gas, everything. Most people, staring at a number like that, reach for their phone. They search quick ways to make money or side hustles that actually work, or they scroll social media until the anxiety softens into numbness. Loretta did something different. She reached across the table and picked up her grandmother's cookbook. It wasn't a published book. It was a binder, really, spiral-bound with a rubber band holding it together and food stains on a third of the pages. The handwriting inside changed slightly as the decades passed, bigger when her grandmother's eyes got worse, smaller in the early years when paper was expensive. The back pages were the most important. They weren't recipes, they were instructions for surviving. Never let a number scare you into a bad decision, her grandmother had written, right there on the inside back cover in pencil. A number is just the truth, and you can always work with the truth. Loretta read that line 3 times. Then she picked up her own pencil and started writing. She didn't write a wish list. She didn't write what she needed or what she deserved or what would have been nice if the world had been kinder that month. She wrote a plan, a real one, line by line, dollar by dollar, meal by meal. Planning before spending, not because someone told her to, because she understood in the bone-deep way you only understand things your grandmother lived rather than just said, that the moment you spend without a plan is the moment the money stops being yours. Gracie wandered into the kitchen just before midnight, couldn't sleep, found her mother at the table surrounded by paper. "You okay, Mom?" Loretta looked up. "Better than okay," she said. "I'm thinking." Gracie poured herself a glass of water and went back to bed. That was enough. The plan was barely a page long, but it was real, and it was hers. And in the morning, it would become the thing that made the difference between getting through the month and not. The first thing Loretta did the next morning, before coffee, before getting the kids up, before checking her phone, was go back to that legal pad. She had written the numbers. Now she needed to write the rules. Not rules from a podcast or a personal finance book, rules from her grandmother, translated into 2026. The first one was simple. No spending before planning. Not a dollar. Not a small thing you tell yourself doesn't count. Nothing moved out of that budget until it had a written reason to be there. Old-timers in her grandmother's community called this envelope thinking. You decided where every dollar was going before it left your hands, not after, not during, before. Your mind made the decision, not the store display, not the end cap sale, not the craving you got standing in the checkout line. Loretta didn't have physical envelopes. She drew 4 squares on the legal pad in pencil, labeled them food, bills, emergency, kids, and wrote a number inside each one. The total of those 4 numbers matched exactly what she had, not a dollar more. That was the whole system. 4 squares on a piece of paper. It took 8 minutes. The second rule was about time. She gave herself 1 hour each Sunday to plan the week. Not to feel bad about the week, not to worry about the week, to plan it. Meals, errands, any money that needed to move. 1 hour. After that, the plan was made, and she didn't revisit it unless something genuinely changed. Her grandmother had said something once that Loretta had never been able to shake. An hour of thinking saves you 10 hours of scrambling. That wasn't poetic license, that was arithmetic. Every hour of calm planning she put in at the start of the week returned itself tenfold in avoided mistakes, avoided impulse spending, avoided the low-grade panic that costs you more than any single purchase ever could. She taped the 4-square budget to the inside of the kitchen cabinet door, not the fridge where guests could see it, the cabinet door, her private dashboard. Every time she reached for a glass or a plate, she saw it. The number, the plan, the commitment. Bo asked her once that week why she kept opening the cabinet and then closing it without taking anything out. She told him she was checking on something. He nodded very seriously, the way 6-year-olds do when they don't fully understand, but they trust you completely. That trust was the weight of everything, and it was the reason quitting was never actually an option. She had decided before the month began what kind of month it would be. That decision, made quietly at a kitchen table with a pencil and 4 squares, was more powerful than anything her bank account could have done for her. She had $62 for groceries, for the whole month, for 4 people. She had been inside that store 100 times before, but never like this. Never with this kind of clarity about exactly what she needed and exactly why. The first thing she did was walk the perimeter of the store without a cart, just looking. Her grandmother had called this learning the land before you farm it. You don't grab things first. You see what's available, what's priced how, what's on sale, and whether the sale is real or theater. Then you make your decisions. Her list was organized not by meal, but by ingredient. This was the key distinction, the one most people miss entirely. A meal-based shopping list ties you to specific dishes. An ingredient-based list gives you building blocks. Dried beans don't commit you to one dinner, they open 6. A whole chicken doesn't lock you into one recipe. It gives you roasted meat on day 1, a stew on day 2, broth for soup on day 3, and something stretched over rice on day 4. Everything she put in the cart was a raw material: oats, rice, flour, butter, eggs, dried beans, a whole chicken, cabbage, carrots, onions, garlic, a block of sharp cheddar, and 2 cans of tomatoes. No brand loyalty. Whatever was cheapest in each category went in the cart. Bo had come with her that morning, which she hadn't planned, but which turned out to be a gift. He spotted the fruit snack display from 20 feet away and came to her with a bag in each hand, the way small children do when they believe the answer might be yes. She crouched down to his level. "Help me pick out the best apples in this whole store," she said, "and tonight I'll show you something sweeter than those." He took the assignment with the absolute seriousness of a professional. He held each apple up to the fluorescent light, checked for soft spots, chose 3 that met his standards. That kept him busy for a full 10 minutes and cost her 89 cents. At the register, the total came to $58.43, $3.57 under her $62 limit. She folded the receipt and put it in her coat pocket like a document. because it was. It was evidence that the system worked, that planning before shopping worked, that thinking about ingredients before thinking about meals worked. She drove home with the groceries in the back seat and Beau asleep with his head against the window, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a week. She felt competent. And that feeling, in the middle of that kind of month, is worth more than any coupon. Groceries were the visible battle. The utility bill was the invisible one. And in January, with 3 kids in the house and temperatures dropping into the 20s, it had the potential to undo everything. Loretta's grandmother had never used the phrase phantom load. She'd never read an article about energy conservation or listened to a podcast about sustainable living, but she had known, with the practical certainty of someone who paid her own bills by hand every month, that leaving things plugged in and lights burning in empty rooms was the same as dropping coins through a hole in your pocket. Slow, steady, invisible, until suddenly the money was gone. Loretta went through the house room by room on a Sunday afternoon and unplugged everything that didn't need to be plugged in. The TV in the kids' room, the second toaster on the counter that nobody used but nobody had ever moved, chargers without phones attached, a small lamp in the hallway that had been on so long it had become invisible like furniture. She wrote a small note and taped it to the kids' TV plug. Unplug when done. Love, Mom. Not a scolding, just a reminder, a habit being built. She dropped the thermostat from 68 to 65 and told the kids that January was a sweater month. She made it sound adventurous. Beau wanted to wear 2 sweaters at once, and she told him that was actually the smarter choice, and he wore them both for a week with tremendous pride. The bigger shift was behavioral. She started gathering the whole family into one room after dinner, instead of everyone disappearing into separate spaces. One room meant one light. One room meant one heat source. One room also meant something she hadn't expected. It meant more conversation, more card games, more of Gracie actually talking about her day, more of Marcus doing his homework where she could see it getting done. The utility savings were real, but the side effects were better. She turned the water heater down by 10 degrees, barely noticeable in the shower. The neighbor had once mentioned offhandedly that it could save $8 or $9 a month. She wrote it on the legal pad. $8 is not nothing. $8 is lunch for 2 of her kids for a week. She saved the water from boiling pasta and used it to thicken soup the next day. She saved the water from rinsing vegetables and used it to water the pot of herbs on the windowsill. Her grandmother had called this second use. Every resource had a second use if you were paying attention. Paying attention, that was the whole skill, and it cost absolutely nothing to develop. She had been steady for 17 days. The plan was holding. The meals were working. The kids were fed and warm and none the wiser. And then it was Tuesday. The school nurse texted at 9:47 in the morning. Beau had a fever of 101. Could she come pick him up? She was already in the car before she'd finished reading the message. Children get sick. That is not a crisis. That is Tuesday. What made this particular Tuesday a crisis was the $40 copay at the clinic she hadn't thought to include in the plan. She had an emergency category in her budget. She had put $41 in it. $41 because she was precise and she was careful and she had tried to think of everything. She handed over the $40 copay without blinking because dignity at the check-in desk is not optional. It is a decision you make in advance. She walked out with $1 left in emergency. She drove home with Beau in the back seat, flushed and limp, holding his stuffed rabbit by one ear. She got him settled on the couch under the quilt her mother had made, turned the TV on low, and went back to the kitchen table. She opened the legal pad and looked at the numbers. She revised them. She crossed out what had changed and wrote what was true now. $11. That was the real number. $11 between now and the end of the month, not counting the food already in the pantry. She closed her eyes for a count of 3. Not to pray, not to panic, just to let the information settle into a plan instead of a spiral. That was a discipline. It didn't come naturally. It was something her grandmother had modeled so many times across so many kitchens that it had become, eventually, her own reflex. She opened the cookbook to the back pages, where her grandmother had written the list she called "What to Do When Things Get Tight." 14 items. She had already been doing 11 of them, but 3 she hadn't tried yet. And the third one on that list read simply, "Swap a dinner for supper. Eggs and biscuits at night cost less than half a proper meal, and the children won't suffer for it. They'll ask for it again." She sat with that for a moment. Dinner for supper, breakfast at night, a tradition so old it predated the Great Depression, practiced in farmhouses and small-town kitchens for generations, now sitting in front of her as a solution with an actual dollar amount attached to it. She got up and checked the pantry. A dozen eggs, flour, butter, salt, more than enough. One bold move. Sometimes that's all it takes to turn a crack back into a plan. That evening, she made scrambled eggs and drop biscuits from scratch, and opened the jar of strawberry jam she had been rationing since December. She set it in the middle of the table like a centerpiece, like something ceremonial, because it was. The kids thought breakfast for dinner was the greatest idea she had ever had in her entire life. Beau, still slightly feverish, sat up from the couch when he smelled the biscuits and ate half a plate with the focused satisfaction of someone who was going to be fine. The whole meal cost $2.60. It fed 4 people, left enough for Beau's lunch the next day, and created a memory that Marcus would bring up at the dinner table years from now, unprompted, as an example of a perfect night. The money saved by swapping that one dinner allowed her to stretch the pantry 2 more days than she had originally calculated. 2 days is not nothing. 2 days is the difference between making it and not making it in a month where every day counted. She went back to the chalkboard on the kitchen wall where she had written the week's meals, erased 2 lines, and rewrote them. Not the meals she had planned, the meals that matched what she actually had. This is called adaptive planning. It sounds clinical when you name it that way. Her grandmother would have called it thinking sideways, finding the other path to the same destination. The next afternoon, a knock at the back door. Her neighbor, a woman in her 70s named Miss Dolores, standing on the step with a paper bag. Inside, a full 2-pound bag of dried black-eyed peas from her own pantry. She hadn't asked. She had simply noticed, the way women of a certain age in small towns always notice, that something in the pattern had changed. Loretta accepted the peas with real gratitude and without apology. "Let me make you a pot of soup when things ease up," she said. Miss Dolores waved her hand. "Make it for your babies first," she said, and went back across the yard. Community, in that sense, is not charity. It is circulation. It is the old economy of mutual care that predated the financial system and will outlast it. Things moving between people who know each other, nothing wasted, nothing owed in a way that diminishes anyone. She made that bag of black-eyed peas stretch across 4 days. Soup on the first day, rice bowls on the second, a hash with the last of the potatoes on the third, mixed into leftover biscuit dough on the fourth. Same ingredients, 4 completely different meals. That is not deprivation. That is skill. The month was turning. She could feel it. And so could the kids, even if none of them had words for what they were feeling yet. It wasn't the money that almost broke her. It was the phone call. Her sister called on a Friday night, the same sister who had always had a little more, always lived a little easier, always meant well in a way that sometimes landed wrong. She could hear it in the first 30 seconds of the conversation, the shift from small talk to something careful, something prepared. Her sister had heard something through the family grapevine. She was offering to help, send a little something, just to make it easier. "I'm fine," Loretta said. 3 words, the most expensive words in the English language, when they aren't true. She hung up and stood in the hallway for a long moment. Then she slid down the wall and sat on the floor with her knees up and her back against the wallpaper, just like she had done as a teenager in a different house, in a different crisis, and she let herself feel the full weight of the month without trying to convert it immediately into a plan. Gracie appeared at the end of the hallway in her pajamas. She saw her mother on the floor, and she did not ask what was wrong, and she did not look frightened. She walked over and sat down beside her, shoulder touching shoulder, and stared at the same spot on the opposite wall. They sat like that for 4 or 5 minutes without speaking. Then Loretta put her arm around her daughter, and her daughter leaned in slightly, and that was all that needed to happen. She called her sister back the next morning. The call was short. She accepted $60, not because she had given up, not because the plan had failed, but because she had finally understood the difference between pride that protects you and pride that costs you. Her grandmother had tried to explain this once, sitting on that same porch swing, in words that hadn't landed yet because Loretta had been too young to need them. "Strength isn't carrying it alone," she had said. "Strength is knowing when to put it down." She wrote the $60 on the legal pad in a new column she labeled simply "Owed Back." She wrote a date 8 weeks out. She underlined both entries. Not charity, a short-term loan from someone who loved her, treated with the seriousness of a financial transaction, because that was what preserved the dignity of both of them. Her sister knew it. Loretta knew it. The $60 moved the needle without changing the story. The story was still hers. The plan was still hers, and she had 7 days left to prove it. 7 days left. She drew 7 tally marks on the kitchen chalkboard in chalk. Not dramatic, just visible. A countdown. It kept her honest. She took inventory of what remained in the pantry and wrote it on a separate page of the legal pad. Not what she wished was there, what was actually there. Oats, half a bag of rice, 2 eggs, a quarter stick of butter, 6 apples, dried pasta, roughly 3 servings, a partial jar of peanut butter, maybe a third full, some crackers in the back of a cabinet she'd forgotten about. She sat with that list and planned 14 meals from it, breakfast, lunch, and dinner for 7 days, for 4 people, from that pantry. It took 35 minutes. It was the most focused 35 minutes of the entire month. Oatmeal every morning. She made it interesting. A pinch of cinnamon one day, a sliced apple another, a drizzle of the remaining honey scraped from a jar she'd thought was empty until she ran it under hot water. The kids ate it. They complained minimally. She considered that a victory. Peanut butter crackers became lunch for 3 days running. Marcus said on the 3rd day, with complete sincerity, that they were actually kind of great when you think about it. She thought about it. He was right. The pasta she made Italian farmhouse style. Olive oil, garlic, salt, a handful of the sharp cheddar grated over the top. The steam filled the kitchen. The smell was warm and full. It cost her less than $1 for the whole pot. It tasted like care, because it was made with care, and those 2 things are not as separate as people imagine. On the 6th day, she found $14 in the pocket of a winter coat she hadn't worn in weeks. She stood in the hallway holding the money for a long moment, the way you do when the universe seems to make an unexpected comment. Another woman, in another kind of month, might have treated herself. Loretta put $12 toward the next week's groceries, which she was already beginning to plan, and kept 2 in the emergency square. Day 7. She erased the last tally mark from the chalkboard. She stood in the kitchen in the quiet of the early morning before the kids woke up and looked at the clean pantry and the clean counter and the legal pad and the cookbook side by side on the table. She had $3.42 left beyond what she had accounted for at the start of the month. Would it be enough? She was standing in the answer. February 1st came in cold and ordinary, the way important days often do. Nothing in the sky announced anything. Bo wanted pancakes. Marcus had lost a shoe. Gracie left the house with her backpack half-zipped because she was running late for school. It was a Tuesday. It was just a Tuesday. After the kids were gone, Loretta sat down at the kitchen table with the legal pad and a cup of real coffee. Not instant, real coffee. A small luxury she had rationed to every other morning, which made this particular cup taste like something earned. She turned to the first page of the legal pad, where she had written on January 1st a single number at the top of the page, $318. She ran her finger down every line, every revision, every crossed-out figure and rewritten number, and unexpected expense and small triumph. She did the final addition twice. Then she looked at the result. Total spent across the entire month, $312. Total remaining, $6. $6. Not a windfall, not a transformation, not the kind of number that changes your life in a single moment, but the kind of number that proves something, that the system worked, that her grandmother's way of thinking about money, ingredient first, plan first, waste nothing, community always, still worked in January of 2026, against real inflation, against a real job loss, against a sick child and an unexpected copay and a pride that almost got in its own way. She wrote at the bottom of the legal pad in letters larger than anything else on the page, "It worked." Then she underlined it. Then she closed the pad and set it on the shelf above the counter next to the cookbook. The kids didn't know they had been short. Bo had genuinely believed January was an adventure, that biscuit nights and sweater days were things the family had invented because they were special and creative. Marcus knew something was different, but had chosen, in the private way 9-year-olds make private choices, to be helpful rather than worried. Gracie knew. She had known since the first weekend when she found her mother calculating at midnight. And she had kept that knowledge like a secret gift, handling it carefully, not making it heavy. That afternoon, Loretta called her sister, not to report a triumph, just to talk. Her sister asked how the month had gone, and Loretta said, "Better than I thought, harder than I wanted, exactly what it needed to be." Her sister laughed, that specific laugh of someone who doesn't fully understand but is glad the person they love sounds like themselves again. That evening, Loretta opened the cookbook to the back pages. She picked up a pencil. In the margin, next to her grandmother's handwriting, she wrote 4 words, "It still works, 2026," and she meant every one of them. Here is what the modern world wants you to believe. That the way to handle financial pressure is to find a better app, a smarter algorithm, a subscription service that categorizes your spending automatically and sends you a notification when you go over budget in a category you didn't know you had. Here is what Loretta's month proved. That was never the problem. The problem was never the tool. The problem was the habit, the reflex, the practiced, pre-decided discipline of thinking before spending, planning before shopping, using before wasting, and asking wisely before suffering silently. Food prices in 2026 are roughly 40% higher than they were 3 years ago. Energy costs have climbed to levels most households have never had to absorb before. Impulse buying has been engineered by some of the most sophisticated behavioral scientists in the world, built into every interface of every device you carry with you every hour of the day. The friction that once stood between you and an unnecessary purchase has been deliberately, systematically removed. That is not an accident. That is a design decision made by someone whose financial interests are not aligned with yours. And into that environment, The frugal traditions of small-town grandmothers walk in carrying a legal pad and a battered cookbook, and a quiet confidence that looks, to the modern eye, almost miraculous. It is not miraculous. It is learned. Every single thing Loretta did that month was a skill her grandmother had practiced until it became automatic. Ingredient-first shopping, envelope budgeting, consumption awareness, adaptive meal planning, the discipline of the Sunday planning hour, the dignity of asking for specific, strategic help, the habit of second use, the courage to look directly at the real number without flinching. These are teachable things. They can be passed down. They can be written on the inside of a cabinet door and reviewed every morning without ceremony. They do not require an income above a certain threshold. They do not require a particular neighborhood or a particular level of education. They require attention and intention and a willingness to be a little less comfortable in the short term in exchange for a lot more stability across the long one. If you watched this whole story and something in it reminded you of someone, a grandmother, a great-aunt, a neighbor who always seemed to know how to stretch what she had further than it had any right to go, this was for her. She knew things that got lost somewhere between the microwave and the delivery app. She knew things that are worth finding again. The 35 traditions we've forgotten aren't historical curiosities. They are tools, and they are available to anyone willing to pick them up. Loretta's daughter, Gracie, is 13 now. She has started keeping her own small notebook. She writes down what's in the pantry before she writes down what she wants. Her grandmother would have recognized that immediately, would have smiled and said nothing, because some things don't need to be made loud to be powerful. Start where you are. Write down what you actually have. Make a plan before you make a purchase. Look at the real number without flinching. And if any of this helped you today, pass it to someone who might need it. That's how it always worked. That's how it still works.